Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Ajanta Dutt, Professor of English from Deshbandhu College, Delhi University, and this is the second lecture on Derek Walcott as a part of the Caribbean Literature course for MA English elective at IGNOU, IGNOU, which is part of the study of the New Literatures in English, MEG 8, Block 6. I am showing you a map of St. Lucia, where Derek Walcott was born, and also starting with Walcott's assertion in his verse as he celebrates and describes his native islands. His assertion or his themes for his poetry capture the natural beauty of the Caribbean islands. His style is often meditative, even incantatory. There is personal isolation in his poetry, in fact in all his works, because he is caught between his black folk culture and his European education. He has, after all, as you know, written in English and lived abroad for a large part of his life. There is also tension-ridden cultural divisions that are evident in the texts of his poetry and plays. There is a wealth of language and language conflicts that he shows in his works. There is expressions of language, especially as it indicates his own race and the conflict that comes from his dual heritage, which I will be speaking about shortly. Because he has lived in the Western world, there is also a sense of separation from his native land, and therefore he also examines and explores the themes of identity and exile in his poetry. I would like to draw your attention to a brief biographical sketch of Derek Walcott. He was the third black and the first Caribbean poet to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in the year 1992. He was born in Castries of St. Lucia, and his grandmothers were both black women, probably descendants from the slaves. However, his grandfathers were both white. One was Dutch and the other was English. His father, Warwick Walcott, died when Derek and his twin brother Roderick were only a year old, and they also had an elder sister, Pamela. His mother, Alex Walcott, who was headmistress of the local Methodist school, brought up these three children completely on her own. Derek Walcott went through an English education, both in St. Lucia and also when he traveled abroad for his studies. From an early age, he studied English, French, and Latin, and was deeply influenced by the classics, especially the Greek classics. He wrote his first poem at the age of 14, and then at 18, he wrote a set of 25 poems, which he published on his own. He had borrowed £200 from his mother, who obviously had deep faith in her son, and he published his work, and then he distributed to all the friends that he could find, literally walking the streets and proposing to people that they should read his poetry. After that came also the founding of the Trinidad Theatre Workshop in 1959, where many of his early plays were staged. He went to New York City, in fact, to study theatre and acting. He also lived in Trinidad and then later on in the United States. He kept coming and going back and forth between the islands and America, and he was faculty professor of poetry and drama in both Boston University and Harvard University. He won many prestigious awards during his lifetime, and of course, the Nobel Prize in Literature was the zenith of achievement in 1992. I have listed for you here his books of poetry, some poems which we will read together, but of course there is so much that he has written that they are absolutely fascinating, and these books can be taken and read one by one. But we also mustn't forget to read his plays and essays, because they are also a very integral part of his thesis, his themes of what it means to be a Black Islander caught between two different worlds. He talks about history, and he talks about the poet and his place in history in many of his poems, and we will find many quotations, therefore, that come to this conflict that rages eternally in his writings. Walcott was not just a poet or playwright, but he was also a painter, which was of course a legacy from his father. And he worked mostly in watercolors. He seemed to be less accomplished in oils, but he was absolutely fabulous when it came to the depiction of rural scenes and seascapes painted with a vivid palette. On the right, you see one of his paintings where you can see the various kinds of blue and grey that he has used in stark contrast with the rocks. He paid always close attention to details, and he worked more and more on paintings after 2001, when he had returned to settle in the islands once and for all. But his prowess in writings surpassed his painting talents. In this slide, we see two more of his paintings, of course, of the islands, the people there, and the quiet, peaceful, almost soothing life that is there in St. Lucia, which even today is considered one of the most beautiful islands of this world. Now we come to Derek Walcott's poetry and the self, especially in this poem, Names. Here he captures for us his dilemma with his dual heritage, and we look at this quote, which actually comes from another poem, A Far Cry from Africa, where he says, "How choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love?" This was a constant conflict in Derek Walcott's mind, because he always felt that he could not give up either his indigenous culture or the European culture that he had acquired, not just in his growing years, but even later. When we come to the analysis of the poem Names, which is taken from his book Sea Grapes, we see the recurring questions of what is history, what is identity, practically in every line of the poem. He dedicates this poem to his contemporary, Edward Braithwaite. Edward Braithwaite, whose picture you see on the right hand side of the screen, was also an extraordinary poet of Caribbean literature. Braithwaite wrote on the devastating effects of slavery and the black diaspora, and he also wrote about his anti-imperialistic ideology, his stance against the colonizers. In his works, Braithwaite was also searching for his roots. He guided his search for orature towards his own people, for the orality of their culture, for the oral transmissions that occurred in their culture, and this captured the imagination of his own people, especially in the 70s. He championed Creole as a national language, and we can look at his book, The Arrivants, which was published in 1970, to see more of his ideological wordplay. Now to tell you a little bit about Names. The more you read this poem, of course, you find more and more layers of meaning. But Derek Walcott starts with a sense of his own history that is contained in the sea. He negates establishing an identity, for he claims that he has no names. When he says this, and he talks about names in terms of the nouns, he is talking about this confusion, this dilemma that is there in his own life, because he is always wondering, who is he? Where is he? Where is he placed? When he talks about his race, he means his own community or his own tribe. But there is a pun on this word because he is also running towards his own individual destiny. As a post-colonial poet of the English language, he belongs to English perhaps first. But he doesn't forget that he also belongs to the French-speaking islanders, and therefore the combination of cultures is always evident in what he says. Therefore, he says in this poem, he was taught to say Maubin, cerise, Bela, but all these words he has really understood through their English equivalents. He concentrates also on sound. The sound of poetry, the sound of verse, the sound that is captured in images. As a poet, he talks of untrained, fresh green voices because he wishes to talk about the innocence of his own people and also his own experimentations, his beginnings in writing English poetry. He talks also about mispronouncing. That is what happens when we are all learning a new language. And therefore, mispronouncing for the natives was predominant, and yet they had to be learning. And during this period, when these natives of these islands were learning the languages provided to them by the European conquerors, their own native languages were getting swept away. Therefore, it is important for the black people to search for their own origins, to recapture what they have lost, which poetically Walcott says, the wind bends our inflections. This quotation is very important because poetry, as we know, should not just be read, but it should also be recited. And in his poetry, he is telling us how the wind blowing in the islands is bringing the winds of change, and how that change is also a loss of culture because that change indicates colonization of these lands. When we look at Walcott's literary devices, we note again sound. It is there in his repetition of words and phrases. So, with the quotation, the mind was halved by a horizon, we think of the intellectual perception of the world as it is divided even today by color, by colonial history, by the various languages coming from the European conquerors, by education, mainly English education in the Caribbean islands, racial prejudice, which is of course the conflict between the colored people and the whites. Then there is the search of the pre-colonial past, but this seems to be a search that is futile because there are no written records left anymore. In this poem Names, he also talks about the exotic cities of Benares, Canton and Benin that once ruled the world. They held the treasure troves, in fact, of the world, but these were again lost to the changes of time, the changes that came with colonial power. And through it all, therefore, there remains a question. Again, a quotation from Walcott, "Have we melted into a mirror, leaving our souls behind?" He uses a metaphor here of the mirror, and he brings the words melted and our souls into this metaphor because he focuses on the 20th century and these words of the quotation also present to us the present reality, the fantasy of reflection that comes with the mirror of a person claiming to be something other than who he is. And then, of course, there is the past. There is the past that is contained in the imagination of the poet. The climax of this poem lies midway through the poem at the end of the first part. It is grand and intense, and I quote, "A sea eagle screams from the rock, and my race began like the osprey with that cry, that terrible vowel, that I." The screaming vowel sound, that first person singular, I, it is so assertive. At the same time, that I, that shrill voice of the eagle, it is agitated, it is agonized. We mustn't forget that the I is a pronoun, and yet it contains the sound of the scream, I, which contains a number of vowels, and it is interrelated, interchangeable, and therefore it becomes that terrible vowel because an identity, again, I for identity, this is the identity that needs to be established. There is also a pun on the word I and the seeing eye, the physical eye, because there are ways of seeing and perceiving as we seek an identity, especially a lost identity. And then there is alliteration and repetition. There are soft sounds in the words. There is the metaphor of the next line, and I quote again, "The sea folded, a history folds over a fish line, and the foam foreclosed." The softness of the F sound as the history seems to fold over is suggesting that something has been lost, but that something which is lost remains in the waves of the sea, so perhaps it can be found again. Walcott always plays with images, and in his imagery we see the natives as children. They are islanders, but they are children who are writing their names upon the sand innocently. And I quote from his poem, "To trace our names on the sand, which the sea erased again to our indifference," unquote. Here we see that the poet is trying to capture a new identity because this has been thrust upon the people. But how do they claim it? How do they comprehend it? That was not something that the colonizers cared about, because they decided that the people needed to know about Europe and European culture, which was predominant, which was superior. So there seems to be a sense of resignation in Walcott's poem as he remembers the fate of being part of the oppressed race of colonized people. The colonized people, whether they are in the Caribbean or elsewhere, they are always dictated by the rules of human nature, political and powerful. It is the colonizers who are political and powerful, and they are telling the colonized people what they have to do, even to the extent of learning a language and a new religion which calls for a change of identity. So we come to the second part of the poem, where Walcott is telling us about the colonizers and the colonized, and incidentally also telling us about the fate of the colonizers who have been left behind on these islands, never to return to their own homelands. So from the confusion of his own people, he shows us the dislocated and displaced state of the colonized who are trying to settle down in these wild but beautiful islands, and they know perhaps that they will never return to their European homelands again. So in a sense, they too have left behind their history and ancestry, left it behind in the European world. They try to recreate the magnificence that they have left behind, the glorious kingdoms of Castile, Versailles and Valencia, and Walcott shows that they are trying to recreate parts of those lands again here on the islands. But of course, recreation can only come through words, and therefore they are engaged in renaming, quote, the uncombed forests and, quote, the uncultivated grass. So the colonizers give these indigenous places in the wild country European place names. I think that Walcott even shows some kind of ironic sympathy for these white masters when he writes, and I quote, names for sour apples and green grapes of their exile, unquote. We are almost reminded of the fable of the fox who said that the grapes were sour, and here the colonizers too seem to think that way about what they are seeing on the islands, because they cannot go back to their homelands and they cannot maybe appreciate what is there on the islands in terms of its bounty. When we think of post-colonialism redefined, we see Walcott's lines again, where he says, quote, the African acquiesced, repeated and changed them. So the people, these native people, the colonized people, now they have to be taught because they are like children. And these colonizers are benevolent because they are teaching them their own culture through their own languages. But language is, of course, an instrument of control, the hegemonic force that is being used by the colonizers. Yet, if we think about it, education is not really forced. It is accepted through the colonized countries, including the Caribbeans, the West Indies, with the consent of the people, and it is accepted for progress. There is, however, also a silence around the erosion of native culture and history, and that is what the poets are trying to recapture and give a voice to. Communication must, of course, ensue in the colonizers' own tongue, and therefore the people have to relearn geography with Eurocentric names like these palms are greater than Versailles. Here there is a half-hearted acknowledgement of the natural beauty of the land, of the islands, that the colonizer must admit to. When we come to the final image, we see constellations in the sky, the stars over Valenthia's forest. The uncivilized savage must learn about the wonders of the Renaissance, scientific knowledge, artistic masterpieces, and therefore the poem ends with the perennial post-colonial definition of unequal status. I quote, "Answer, you damned little Arabs." "Sir, fireflies caught in molasses." In this quotation, we see the rage and frustration of the colonial master, and there is pathos and helplessness in the answer of the colonial subject. But what is poignant is the metaphor of the molasses, the sticky sweet trap, not just actually the molasses and the fireflies gleaming in them, but the people, the indigenous people, caught in this sticky sweet trap that they want, that they cannot reject, because the new education is bringing them new reaches. This is a colonial identity too irresistible to reject, and therefore the words literary, which is a derogatory term, and damned, which is both scolding and condemning, is accepted, because after all they are the masters, and these poor people, they are caught and they must abide by what the masters say. These indigenous people are a people with no history, no geography. This has to be relearned in Eurocentric terms. All the colonized world, therefore, is the same. All are Arabs to the colonizers. Why distinguish between them and the Africans or the islanders? To the colonizers, all the places that they go to and they conquer and they receive the bounty of, they are all the same. So there is their arrogance versus the acceptance of the people. So we end this lecture on this point of what the colonizers thought of the indigenous people and how they are trying to also find a voice which is carried over into the other poems by Derek Walcott, so that his poetry gets intermingled and intersected with the colonial images and the post-colonial imagination. Thank you.